Welcome everyone to VC Ag Today on this Thursday morning, August 13th, 2020. Our topic of discussion this morning is going to be late summer pasture management, and we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Katie Payne, who is our Applied Forest System Specialist at the Southern Piedmont AREC with Virginia Cooperative Extension and Virginia Tech. Dr. Payne is going to be sharing some advice on some late summer pasture management and just some tips to, as we go into the fall, some considerations for reseeding and how to set up your pastures and hayland for a productive 2021 growing season. So we appreciate everyone joining us this morning. Thank you for being here. Just one housekeeping note. We ask that if you have questions or comments for Dr. Payne, if you could please hold those toward the end of the presentation. We'll open it up for questions and comments at the end. If you have a comment or question, if you have the ability to put that in the chat box here on Zoom, if you would just enter that into the chat box, we'll address those at the end of the presentation. So with that being said, Dr. Payne, we appreciate you joining us this morning, and thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for asking me to be here. I'll get my screen set up here. And so it's a great time to be talking about fall pasture management and some renovation techniques that we might be using here within the next month or so. But first, I wanted to kind of give a background about me. I've been here at the Southern Piedmont AREC for a little over a year. And I'm originally from Century, West Virginia. Grew up raising beef cattle. And when I was a teenager, our extension agent said, I'm going to show you what's going on under those hooves, and got me interested in soil judging, and got a Bachelor of Science at West Virginia University in soils. And then I figured out the best way to mix those two worlds of soils and beef cattle was going into forages. So I went and got a master's at the University of Georgia, working with Dr. Dennis Hancock, and finished up my PhD at the University of Kentucky with Ben Goff and Ray Smith. So jumping right into some pasture renovation, there are a lot of different reasons that you may be interested in renovating a pasture. Some of this first picture, you may want to consider moving away from the Kentucky 31 toxic endophyte tall fescue into a novel. That's a lot of what we're seeing these days with pasture renovations. You could be having stands that are getting thin, that have been heavily overgrazed, moving more towards weed species. And then you could be wanting to just try something new. If you have a wildlife area here at the Southern Piedmont AREC, we've converted a 15-acre area into native grasses that will be starting grazing next summer. Or you could have had a wet winter or a wet summer, had to hold those animals in a sacrifice area, have a lot of pugging, and that requires some renovation now. And then one of my favorite reasons is to incorporate legumes into your grass pastures. So when we design a renovation strategy, timing is everything. And really the best time here in Virginia, we think about our base grass system, our cool season grasses. So the best time to establish those are in late August to early October. And you can plant in the spring, but there are some challenges. You may have excess moisture. You'll have stress from the summer and weeds. So usually we try to recommend planting in the fall. And so when does this renovation plan need to start? Well, now really, a few weeks ago. It really takes a lot of planning, making decisions, and really following through with the management. So I'll go through some steps. First, as you're making your plan, first step is, what species are you looking for in establishing? So really you want a species that's adapted to your area. There's no use here in Virginia trying to establish something like perennial peanut when you know, or Bahia grass, when you know it's not going to do the best up here. So here, traditionally, we think tall fescue-based systems. You want to make sure your forage species is adapted to your soils. Make sure that it's going to get you the yield that you need. Make sure it's going to have the nutritive value that your livestock require. And make sure it's going to adapt to your conditions. And make sure that that species is going to be able to adapt to what you're using it for. Such as when we think about whether to choose red clover or white clover, red clover may work better in a hay operation, where white clover may work better in a pasture where we're going to graze. And also you want to think about, how long is that plant going to last out there? How long is it going to persist before you have to go back and start this process over of trying to reseed? Step 2 is weed control, and that's really one of the biggest steps in planning your renovation, because you have to be able to control the weeds before you go into seeding. As of right now, there aren't any available herbicides to kill broadleaf weeds and leaf clover. However, Corteva is coming out with a product called Proclova. It'll be commercially available next spring, that will allow you to keep white clover, and it's also allowing you to keep some of the annual Lespedezas. But so far they found that it doesn't work too well on keeping red clover in the pasture. When we talk about herbicides, you want to make sure that they match the weeds that are present. You want to correct them at the rate that's recommended on the label. You want to make sure you're at the right growth stage. There's no use in applying. You're wasting money if you're applying herbicide on a fully mature weed plant that's already dropping seed onto the ground. You want to make sure that you are getting them while they're young and susceptible. And you also have to plan on, certain herbicides may have restrictions on when you can seed after those applications, or even when you can graze after those applications. And one of the biggest things, especially in renovating, is considering using herbicides and smother crops to reduce weed seed production. So I'll go through a couple of those smother crop systems that have kind of been tested. So we're going into the fall. We're thinking about completely renovating. So if we're going to do a fall seeded smother crop, we would kill the sod or the problem weeds in late summer. And then we may seed a small grain as a winter cover crop. However, we want to make sure that we, to make it truly smother and reduce the amount of weeds that come up, use at a higher seeding rate than we normally would. And then you can harvest those small grain plants for hay or silage, or you could harvest the grain. However, in these systems, you may not be able to plant in the spring if that was your plan. Or if you wanted to plant a good fescue or a cool season grass, you can plant a warm season grass in this system. For summer seeded smother crops, again, going in in late spring, we would kill the sodder or problem weeds, and then we could seed a summer annual, such as sorghum Sudan grass or foxtail millet, again at a higher seeding rate. Harvest that in late summer for hay or silage, or you could graze it. And then spray and seed a forage crop in the fall. But really, as for renovating a tall fescue pasture, we want to think about combining both of those, where we would do the fall smother crop sequence, follow it up with a summer smother crop, and then spray and seed our tall fescue or our cool season perennial grass that following fall. So it does take time. Like I said, this was the ideal situation for the conversion of toxic to novel endophyte tall fescue. And there has been some research down at NC State recently completed that showed the benefits of using these processes. And I don't have a slide, but you can also consider doing a couple seasons of like doing Roundup Ready crops. You could get some income while you're in the renovation process. Step 3, adjust soil fertility. To me, this is one of the most important steps, and I could call it the most important step, and I could talk about it all day. But really, the basis of our soil fertility program is getting a soil test. You want to make sure that you're getting representative soil samples, at least 20 cores per sample, to make sure you're getting a good representation. Sample each pasture separately, or if your pastures are split up, you want to make sure that you're representing each management type by themselves. And you also, for pastures, you want to make sure that you're getting the proper depth. We usually recommend 2 to 4 inch depth. Unless you've recently tilled, then it can go to the regular 6 inches. And then you want to make sure to avoid those camp stock areas where animals congregate around water, feed troughs, shaded areas, and fence lines or gates. And we recommend testing graze pastures every 2 to 3 years because we are getting recycled nutrients from the animals, and hay fields because we're removing those nutrients. We really need a soil test every year in those systems to replace those nutrients because we're taking them off. And just a general rule of thumb, after you've gotten your soil test and you get your recommendations, we want to try to adjust pH depending on the forage species that you're growing and your area. Try to get it between a 6.0 and a 6.8, higher end for legumes and alfalfa. And we also want to adjust the phosphorus and potassium as needed according to the soil test. Step 4, we consider suppressing the existing sod. We want to make sure that we're reducing that plant residue. We're doing that to make sure that we're getting the seed in the right place and that we're getting good seed to soil contact. You can suppress the existing sod that's reducing competition for light, water, and nutrients. You can hard graze. This top picture shows some lighter grazing, and the bottom picture some harder grazing down to the bottom, which may result in better seed to soil contact for that renovation. And if we want to suppress with herbicides, glyphosate is usually the way to go if we want to control it. It gets down in the roots better than a gramoxone or paraquat. Paraquat may be better for suppression. It is a little bit more dangerous chemical plants, so be careful when you are using those. And then really getting a good soil to seed contact is our next step. And that really goes back to our seeding methods and being able to introduce those seeds to that soil. You can use frost seeding, livestock seeding. You can do some minimum tillage practices, or one of the most reliable is no-till in established pastures. So livestock seeding, there's been some talk about it. You feed the seed to the livestock, and legumes usually work better than grasses in that situation. It's not really uniform. It can take 4 to 5 years to get 1 manure pile per square yard, so it takes time. It's not the best practice. You can get high germination rates on the actual manure pile, but getting the roots to actually penetrate the soil from those seedlings can be difficult. And also, it's hard to keep the seed inoculated as it passes through the animal and into the soil. Frost seeding is, you can broadcast the seed onto the soil surface in late winter or very early spring. You want to be able to get it out there early enough that you're getting freeze and thaw cycles to really incorporate that seed as those soils kind of shrink and swell during the winter. It works best with red and white clover. It can work with grasses. It's not the best with alfalfa. But like I mentioned, it really works the best with red and white clovers. You really have to work at minimizing the residue that's on top of the soil, because that seed has to reach that bare soil to be able to incorporate through those freeze-thaw cycles. And it's important to get even distribution if you want an even stand. And if there's some soil disturbance, can help getting frost seeded established. Minimum tillage can be used. You can graze the pasture hard to reduce some residue. You can use some light tillage. You might want to go in with some light tillage, 40 to 60% of the sod. Broadcast the seed, or you can use a drill. Cultipacking or dragging to get a good soil to seed contact again. Here it's important to control the competition after you've seeded, either by clipping or grazing. And then no-till takes more effort and attention to detail, but it really is a more consistent result. and it's directly putting that seed into contact with the soil. And this method can be successful in spring or fall. If you're trying to establish alfalfa, that would be the best method to use. You can, again, you need to suppress the residue. And calibrating the drill before seeding is very important. But one of the most important things, and often the biggest reason for stand failure or plants not coming up, is planting at the wrong depth. So you want to check and recheck the seeding depth before you start going out to plant. You rarely ever need anything deeper than a half an inch. Don't trust what someone tells you. Make sure that you're going out there before you plant and check it yourself. And there's a general rule that you should be able to see some of the seed along the slit from the no-till drill. And if you don't, then you're probably too deep. And again, it's important to control post-seeding competition. If you're planting in the spring, and you can use pre-emergent herbicides, that may help some of that post-seeding competition. Step 6 is, again, controlling this competition, and that can often determine the success or failure of the planting. Seedlings aren't very tolerant of competition. You want to keep that canopy open so they can get the nutrients and sunlight and water that they need to really establish that root system to get them growing. You can, if you're good at managing your animals, you can flash graze, where you put a large number of animals onto a small area and graze to just above the seedlings. That can be difficult. That's why I say that you need to be able to manage those animals pretty tightly. You can also clip frequently just above those seedlings. And really it takes those seedlings to get up to 4 to 6 inches before they can start competing on their own. So now that we've planted, our plants are 4 to 6 inches, they're able to compete on their own, we kind of want to look at some of the pasture management that we want to take after it's been established. That first year, we want to graze lightly and let it rest as much as possible in our first spring and summer, because those plants actually take up to 2 years to fully establish. And it's good to allow seed heads to form before that first cutting. That way, when plants form those seed heads, they start sending nutrients back down to the roots. That's going to get the nutrient reserves back into the root to give them a good carbohydrate reserve for regrowth. You also want to continue controlling those weeds in these cool season grass pastures. And then I always say, or I always recommend, don't plant legumes during that first year of establishment. That way you can control those weeds during that first year and then come back that second spring to really, you've gotten your weeds under control. Now we can go back and plant a legume species that spring. That way we're getting the nitrogen benefit from those legumes. We're increasing yield, increasing digestibility, and crude protein, and reducing fiber content. So really, I'm a big supporter of incorporating legumes into grass pastures. So those were some of the steps in establishing a renovation strategy. Now I'll just kind of go through some of the basic management practices that you may want to do this late summer or fall in an established pasture. So it's really important to soil test and keep up with your nutrient management. Fall is actually the ideal time to correct for pH because it does take lime about 6 months before it even starts to correct pH in the soil. So getting that on in the fall will help you get off to a great start the following spring and summer. You also want to apply some low rates of nitrogen and potassium, and that will help in the fall get some tillering from that nitrogen to help it overwinter, and also potassium is really important for overwintering forages. As we go into fall, our plants are starting to slow down in production. We want to make sure that we're getting as much out of it as we can. So rotational grazing is a good management strategy to go into that, to be able to extend what growth we're getting. But you want to make sure that you're leaving enough stubble height to really save some of those carbohydrates for winter, overwintering. So we usually recommend leaving pastures at 4 to 5 inches. And then a big thing is stockpiling those cool season grasses, especially here where we have a lot of tall fescue. Tall fescue is a great forage for stockpiling. So with stockpiling, we would clip it right about now, mid-August to late August, apply some nitrogen, and just allow whatever grows to accumulate until December or so. When we're looking for a field to pick to do this, we want one with a strong sod that has good drainage to help relieve any standing water that may have, to help reduce deterioration of that plant material. We also want to protect those fields from overgrazing during the summer or early fall. Like I mentioned, we would clip those pastures in late summer, trying to remove those weeds in the old growth before we apply that nitrogen, leaving it at that 4-inch residual height. Like mentioned, about 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen in late August to mid-September. I had done some research with my PhD that going over about 80 pounds of nitrogen didn't help with stockpile yields. So you wouldn't want to spend too much money on nitrogen. Like I mentioned, we're going to allow that growth to accumulate to mid-December. And if there is, you may consider feeding hay during the period of when we're allowing it to accumulate if there is grazing, just so we'll have that fresh growth later. And then as we see with the seasonal distribution of the cool season grass curve, again, we have our summer slump, but allowing that tall fescue to stockpile in the winter, we're really going to save money on hay. So this is in mid-February, and as those plants start to deteriorate, some of that crude protein is actually going to become more available because it's coming out of the cell wall easier. So we do have really good high nutritive value forage. And so to get the most out of your stockpile, you always, if you have grass legume mixtures, like I mentioned, the legumes and other forage species don't stockpile as well as tall fescue. So you may want to utilize those mixtures first because they're going to deteriorate quicker than a pure tall fescue stand. And you also want to strip graze. So start off with your polywire or temporary fencing. There's no need for a back fence because it's not going to regrow until early spring. But it is important to manage that grazing, and can be really high quality forage. It's kind of in summary for pasture renovation, timing is everything. You want to make sure that you're selecting the best species for your systems, getting weeds under control, taking soil test, getting residue off of the soil surface, and ensuring seed to soil contact, and giving it the best chance after it's established by controlling competition. And in terms of fall management, again, soil testing, it's very important. You want to make sure you're rotationally grazing to get the most out of it and leave that residual height to get those carbohydrates back into the plant roots. And I want to take a challenge for everyone. If you're able to fence off a field or something and try to stockpile this fall to really get that high quality forage this winter. Before I go, there is still some time to enter. If you've made some high quality hay, consider entering the Southeastern Hay Contest. Talk to your extension agent about submitting a sample. And also a little plug that Virginia Tech Forages is now on Facebook and Instagram. And we welcome any followers and recommendations. And so with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Payne. We really appreciate you being here and sharing those great comments and presentation. I guess at this point, we'll go ahead and just check to see if we have any questions or comments. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'm gonna just go ahead and make it so you all have the capacity to unmute yourselves. If you have a question or comment, we'll go ahead and open it up at this time for discussion.
This is Brad Jarvis in Madison.
Hi, Brad.
I have a question on herbicide use on pastures with 30% legumes in them. Apparently Prowl, is that labeled for that? And 2,4-D-B, the mean formulation, seems to be two applications that are a little bit softer on preserving clover. There are some restrictions. I'm not exactly sure what they are off my head. I think the grazing restrictions, like, was pretty long. It's like 60 days. Haying restrictions less. It's like 45. Would there be any advantage of that, or when do you determine when you can sacrifice clover with a herbicide to improve your pasture utilization? I guess I'm saying there are studies out there of what percent weed infestation makes sense to sacrifice some clover and then come back and frost seed it. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Usually I recommend to people, if you have less than 25% clover in a field, and if it's not an intermediate or a Ladino type clover, and if it's just like a small Dutch clover, even then, if it's over 25% of it and it's just that small Dutch clover, then I would consider sacrificing that clover content, because it's not going to be worth the amount of nitrogen that it supplies, because it doesn't really supply that much.
Yeah, that's my thought. I think if we looked at this economically, I think sacrificing some clover pays in the long run versus the cost of frost seeding 5 pounds of clover. Plus they're mixed stands. I think if you put those down, you can certainly, if you have the ability to make hay, you know, some people are sticking closely to clover, but if you're making hay and you have to wait 45 days, well, heck, in the middle of summer, many times we're waiting 45 days after the first cutting to make our hay. So I just don't see a lot of research out there to fully push that out as a recommendation. I do it with case by case depending on the farmer, but we do have a lot of weeds. We're trying to protect a lot of clover, and so just trying to develop some strategies to make that work or happen.
There was a lot of research back in the 60s and 70s, but we didn't look too much at weed percentages and such, but in my PhD research at Kentucky, I was using enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers on grass clover mixtures, and I had come across a lot of stuff about when and when not to consider eliminating the legumes that you do have in the pasture to get rid of the weed content. So I think that 20-25% of like good intermediate or Ladino type clover is kind of what the norm is for recommendations.
I have another question if no one else has any. I very rarely recommend tillage unless it's really a truly compacted situation. The no-till drill is just so easy to use. The hardest part is learning how to calibrate it, and if you have a nice shop or a nice piece of soft ground to lay on, you can get that done. But if you do have to attack some hard pans or some compacted soil in some of your pastures because of equipment running over making hay, would it be reasonable to think that we could overseed brassicas in those fields as a way to improve soil health and tilt to kind of penetrate that hard pan?
Yeah, I know it's been done down in Auburn. Leanne Dillard is doing some research with brassicas, and I believe she's looking at its effect on compaction and everything. And if I'll make a note of it right now, I'll ask her what she's found, and I'll get back to you on that.
Well, I was wondering what, we had to give brassicas in by the middle of August, the 1st of September for them actually to do anything because they're not very cold tolerant. So I'm trying to wonder what the stand of grass needs to look like. Does it have to be a pretty open canopy, or does that brassica seed heavy enough to penetrate? I won't say it dense. Something, if it's 6 to 8 inches tall, can that brassica seed make it to the soil level to actually germinate and do something, or do we have to bring it down below at 3 inches or lower to make sure we have germination of those brassica seeds?
Yeah, I would make sure that it's lower than 6 inches for sure.
Plus, you got feed there as well.
Hmm.
The cattle, if you bring them in after the grasses grow, the cattle will come pluck them out of the ground and eat them.
Right.
Dr. Payne, we had a question submitted for a producer that couldn't join us today, and he had a question on a recommendation for a species that could be planted now in anticipation of some production and growth that could be utilized this fall, late summer into the fall, but it would also overwinter and come back next spring. I know that'd be very tough with something like some of our traditional cool season perennials like tall fescue, orchard grass. The thought that come to mind for me maybe be something like ryegrass if they can hold off long enough to let that get going good this fall. Any comment or recommendation on that?
Yeah, if he just wanted it for this fall and late winter, early spring, he could do small grain or annual ryegrass. You could even mix it with crimson clover or winter pea. I've got a project that will be planted in September, looking at different mixtures of cool season annuals of grasses and legumes. So, and hopefully one day we'll get that turned into a grazing study. But I think if he's looking for just late fall growth and early spring growth, then I would go with a winter annual.
All right, thanks, Dr. Payne. Any other comments or questions this morning for our guest speaker on this topic? All right, well, thank you again, Dr. Payne. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. Great presentation and some great advice for folks as we come into the following months preparing for this. Just a few comments I'd like to make. Next week, we'll be joined by one of our fellow extension agents, Mr. Carl Stafford in the Northern District. And we're also going to have a producer on the line with us. And the topic of discussion is going to be extending grazing time in Eastern Virginia. And we're just going to look at some different scenarios, talk a little bit about some things that folks are doing in the area, utilizing some of these annual species to do that. Also maybe having Carl touch a little bit on some of the Graze 300 initiative and some of the stuff that the folks in the northern and western part of the state are doing, and see if that can be adapted a little bit to the eastern part of the state here. So if you're interested in that, or you have producers interested in that, please encourage them to join us next week. Also, thank you for being with us. If you just take a few moments and fill out our brief evaluation for the program. I think you just saw the link there on the screen. So if you could follow that link, and I think Stephanie normally posts that in the chat as well. So just take a few moments to provide us some feedback, and also let us know if there's a topic you'd like to see featured. We'd be glad to do the best we can to get that. So with that being said, thank you again, Dr. Payne. Thank you for everyone else that's joined us this morning. Appreciate your time, appreciate you being here. And just like to thank the team of agents and interns that make this effort possible. Mike Broadus, Stephanie Romelchek and her summer intern, Skylar Swan, Mr. Trent Jones, Laura Maxey-Nay, and her summer intern, Shelly Underwood. So thank you all again for joining us this morning, and we really appreciate everyone being here. Stay safe, take care, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday morning.